Welcome to Seatton Education. I'm your host, Victoria. Every week, we talk to expert guests from around the world to show that home education really can be an achievable alternative to conventional schooling. Joining me today is Randall Hardy, who has campaigned and lobbied tirelessly to protect the right of families in the United Kingdom to choose how they educate their children. Randall, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Victoria.
And maybe you can start by just telling our audience how you got involved in this world of home education, or, well, there's a phrase that you prefer to use. Why don't you start with that?
Well, that's one of my little campaigns at the moment because home education, particularly since lockdown, but it was going that way already, is a catch-all phrase for so many different types of learning. And increasingly, it's online learning, full-time tutoring online, or people bringing tutors into the home. And traditionally in Britain, home education has been what I'm now calling family-based learning. The word home is a bit misleading because we hear civil servants saying we have to come inspect your home because you're a home educator. And they're not getting away with that, but it gives the wrong impression. It gives the impression of the child being locked in the classroom at home all the time. And actually, most home educators do an awful lot of learning out of the home with other children and in other places. But I also want to distinguish between where it's just simply hiring in a tutor or tutors online to do the teaching. Family-based learning is really what it's about. It's been learning life skills within the family.
And of course, it differentiates from a lot of these online schools that have set up as well, which are very much schools. You log on at 9 o'clock and you finish at 4 p.m. and you're in a classroom, because that's sort of sometimes branded as home education now as well, isn't it?
Well, it's the only thing the government can call it because the children are not registered at school. And even though the term home education does not exist within British legislation, it is the coverall term they have. And another thing that's happening is that there's a lot of parents, and it's not home education, just looking for places they can take their children and drop them during the day. And they come under the home education bracket, but it's not family based.
And could you start by giving us an overview of how UK taxation and fiscal policy has changed over the decades in regards to, well, let's start with just the family.
Well, let's start with the family then. You can tell I'm not a youngster by the colour of my beard and the colour of my hair. I remember when I was little, my mum and dad always talking about the married man's allowance when it came to tax, and whether it had gone up or whether it had gone down. What it meant was you got your individual allowance, and then if you were married, you got an extra amount to cover your wife. I have no idea whether it worked the other way around, if the wife was working and the man was looking after the children, but it was called the married man's allowance. But that was what most families did. The man to pay less income tax if he was married. And on top of that, there was actually a children's allowance as well. And that went on for quite a while, but then it began to dwindle. And tax year 2000, 2001, it was abolished altogether. It is this policy that actually says we want both parents in a family out at work. And if there's only one, we want that thing, because otherwise they're economically inactive. And that is from then on, really, both parents had to be working. And now we've got a tax system where people are taxed individually, and it's very hard if one parent is working for them to get a reasonable amount transferred. And that really is a problem. It is an anti-family problem, issue.
So we've talked about the married men's allowance being taken away, but there's also when I was a child allowance wasn't means tested, whereas now it is in line with income, isn't it?
Yeah.
So several families who would have had it in the past now don't get any child allowance.
Certainly, if we did a deep dive into it all, we find there was lots of little adjustments in the tax system, the benefits system, that actually is pushing both parents out to work. And that means it does away something incredible, Victoria. We now pay people to look after our children and to look after our elderly parents. When I was little, I was the youngest of 3 generations in the house most days. We didn't all live in the same house, but we spent a lot of time together because my mother was looking after me and her parents' generation at the same time.
My next question really is like, does this matter? Do families matter? You know, is it important to keep families together, or should we say, aren't we lucky? The government thinks they know what's best for our children. Shouldn't we just let them take control?
Well, that is the current direction of travel, not just in the UK, but across the Western world. The current direction of travel is the state makes a better parent than the parent. And that is a real difficult thing. You can see it. At the last general election, I did a deep dive into the policies of all the parties, and the majority of them were saying, we really care for the family, we're giving them more and more free childcare. But there's nothing that you can buy that replaces time of a parent and the child spent together. And that is what matters. I won't say it's the original, but one of the early examples of this approach was Sparta, where they really didn't believe in the family. They actually tried to get rid of the family. It is the same mindset. And it's a real threat because we've got a mental health crisis amongst children, which predates lockdowns.
Yes.
And the thing that nobody asked is, why have we got it? And it's not, it predates mobile phones. It is that we have changed social structure in the West to get rid of not just nuclear families, but extended families. And it is the whole extended family that is the real place of security. There's some research been done in Finland where they brought in free childcare, not compulsory, from a few months old, but it was free, state-funded childcare. And the first children through that are now later teens, or they were a few years ago. And an academic decided to study the mental health of these children who'd been through full-time childcare away from parents, apart from at evenings and weekends. And they found that it is actually creating a mental health crisis in our young people.
And I mean, we're seeing that in the UK. So as you know, from the 2nd of September this year, the age at which state-funded childcare being introduced it's gone down. We've seen it year on year from 3 to 2 years of age to 18 months and most recently to 9 months. There's now 15 hours of free childcare available. And when I was reading the government policy on that, on the government website, I noticed they'd rebranded it as early education is now available from 9 months. Now, there is no piece of academic research that I have come across that suggests or promotes education for babies of 9 months old. Quite the opposite. There's huge benefit to children of 9 months being with their parents. And yet I thought exactly what you're saying. When a government makes a policy and uses words like fantastic news, early education freely available for children from 9 months, it makes parents think that that is the right thing to be doing for their children. People don't go and look at the research. They think, well, it must be the right thing. And within, I'm not even talking generations, I'm talking within a year or two, that becomes so normalized that then everybody opts into it, whether they need to be sending their child to nursery or not.
That is exactly what they're wanting to do. It's this thing. And worse than that, Victoria, I don't know if you've picked up the latest government advice to go out about pre-compulsory school-age children is if they are in reception or such like.
Before formal education begins.
Before formal education begins, we've got this iniquitous system where a parent has now been defranchised in this country. My parents could use their parental responsibility and authority to say Ramble will not be in school today, and it will be marked as an authorised absence because my parents authorised it. Now, if a parent wants to keep a child off school, just even for a grandparent's funeral, say, they have got to get permission from the school. And if they don't get permission, it's an unauthorised absence. So the authority for education has moved for school-aged children from the parent to the state, who oversees the school system. But worse than that, the latest guidance says that with preschool-aged children who are in preschool education, that if their parents keep them off for a day, they can be fined. And it is not a compulsory school-age matter. But what they're trying to do, and I'll use your podcast to warn everybody, if they're thinking of putting their children in childcare, you'll probably be given a contract. Read that contract very carefully. And if you find anything in there that says, I will ensure my child attends every day they are well, or something like that, cross it out. And say you won't sign it unless that's taken out, because otherwise they will be fined.
I think it's really important to make the point here that this is the same for private schools. You know, we have lots of people say, oh, well, I understand there's issues with the state controlling children through the state sector. That's why I'm sending my child to a private school. We were speaking to someone recently whose daughter was being disciplined, and the father said, I want to be in on the disciplinary meeting because I want to know what's going on here. And they said, you can't be in that meeting. And he said, why? And they said, you signed a contract with the school that the school deals with disciplinary issues. This was a day school. So she was going home every evening, and her father wanted to sit in. And in the end, he was allowed in, but he had to sit behind a screen with his back to his daughter, and he wasn't allowed to influence her during the meeting.
It's terrible, isn't it? It is a lack of respect for parents which has spread through the whole of education.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's actually the roots of free education. Remember that old saying, give me a child till they're 7 and I'll show you the man? That was taking other people's children and teaching them your values. And the whole education system has that sense of taking other people's children and imposing somebody else's values on them. The moment a school says a parent cannot sit with his daughter when we're talking about discipline with them, that is a moment we know that the parent has lost their authority, their responsibilities. And that is the big argument around home education in this country. It's a political hot potato. It's what I spend a lot of my time doing, trying to fight it. But it's really over who parents the child, the state or the parent. And the narrative is, well, parents are rubbish these days. We can't trust them. So the state has got to do it. But I do remember, I don't know if you remember the Scottish named person scheme. Every child in Scotland would be given a named person who could see all their records, keep an eye on them without talking to their parents. That's what it was. And it was the home educators in Scotland spotted what was wrong with it. They took the case to court. It went to the highest court in the UK, the Supreme Court. And so the scheme had to be scrapped and everything. And but that was complete state oversight, saying we can't trust the parents. It's no longer a compulsory scheme, but a lot of the social workers and people like health visitors in Scotland still think it's a very good thing and try and implement it in other ways. An independent social worker called Maggie Mellon said the main reason she got involved was from her experience as a social worker, the state makes a lousy parent. And the state doesn't believe it. The state believes it's a good parent, but there's now a category that some people are pressing for, a protected characteristic of a care experienced person. Anybody who's been in care, they recognize they've been damaged by being in care.
Wow.
And they want this category of care experienced person. And there's a global movement. It doesn't get the headlines because it isn't a positive message that the state knows best. And in this country, even if people don't decide to home educate, they need to be careful because the Children's Commissioner has been calling out for a single unique identifier for every child. In other words, a number branded on their records, their digital records, which can be, and the information on that database can be shared freely across all services. And that will become a track and trace system for every child, whether they're in school or not. And the Labour government put it in their manifesto that they will seek to implement that system. So it's really parenthood we're talking about here.
Some people might say, well, if we live in a state that we essentially trust and it's a benign regime, then what do we have to fear?
When I started this political activism in 2009, 2010, and home education first appeared on order sheets in the Houses of Parliament, since it was allowed as education otherwise than in school, there was a lot of fears put forward, and minister after minister would say the government believes the best place for a child to be educated is in school. And nobody had any evidence that it was. Nobody does the research. When it's convenient, the government will make a claim like that. They will not ask for research. There's no research there, but it is children spending time with parents, not just the early years. It is as they grow up. Naturally, historically, the normal thing has been throughout the bulk of human history for children to grow up around their parents, becoming a team member in the family, learning skills, learning things, and that equips them for life.
Yes. And
now we have this thing where we say, oh no, school's the best place. You've got to remember that 50% of the adult population in prison cannot read and write. They cannot add up. That's 50%. Wow. And the majority, and all of them essentially, have been to school. It's not working. But it's also robbing families of time for bonding.
In saying that the state knows better, it is important to remember that the state may be able, working at its best, in the opinion of some people, to provide some things, but they cannot provide stable, secure, unconditional love. We would not expect them to. And then all I would say is then you make the link between why we then have a mental health crisis, why we have people who don't have purpose, why we have people who can't interact with people outside of their own peer group. These things are linked to the erosion of a parent's role in a child's life.
Yes, they are.
We started by talking about fiscal policies favoring the individual unit for work, but it's for taxation. Let's not forget that. That's why the state wants us all to be individual
the main
workers.
reason.
Yeah. And so I think that is a problem for home educators, because typically, and there are some people who work it differently, but typically one partner is going to be staying home to educate the children. Clearly, these fiscal policies disadvantage families who are choosing for one person to stay at home. And yet we have seen a rise in home education. I wondered if you could just speak to the reasons that you've seen driving that increase.
Yeah, that's a long list, but it's a very simple list. There's a growing number of people who are saying no to state education. The longest standing reason has been peer-on-peer bullying and abuse in schools. That is still going on. Some campaign about 3 years ago where it just took off because of the sexual abuse in school.
Mm.
Bullying and abuse in school is a long-standing problem. There's this growing number of young people with special educational needs, neurodiversity described at some times, and schools as often a very hostile environment for them to be in. A large number of people began home educating for the sake of their child, and many of those actually say it's the best thing they've done. So that was the trigger, was the state failing, but they've found a better place. Mental health and well-being, we've concerns we've mentioned. Lockdowns did an awful lot to get people aware of home education. Our oldest 3 children were not home educated. I'd never heard of it. It was only through getting involved in a parent cooperative school that I met people who talked about home education.
Mm.
And that was, quite a high percentage chance I would never heard about it. But now nearly everybody in the country's heard about it, partly because of the political campaigns against it, but lockdowns gave people a foretaste. But then governments are doing daft things. They're doing things to upset parents and get them out of school. And all the time saying, we want your children in school, but if you send them to us, we're going to teach them what we want to teach them. And there's for years been a recognition of parental authority when it comes to sex education. And parents always had a right, like they did with religious education, to withdraw their children from those classes. Well, recently that's been taken away, and there's been a new emphasis put on sex education. In Wales, it's not just in special lessons now, it's right through the curriculum. It's teaching sex relationships education. And some parents from religious, ethnic minorities are balking at this and saying, we don't want our children teaching that. They can't send them to private schools because the private schools are still governed and they're inspected and things. And it was predictable. It was very predictable that this would send up the numbers of home education. And now we've got this culture in schools that makes unreasonable demands on parents and blames them for children not coping in school. There was a series of adverts at the beginning of the autumn term showing happy children in the playground, and then a flashback how they were feeling that morning. And parents, you need to get them into school because they'll be a lot happier when they are. Rubbish. But it's the state is now bullying parents. And I have to say, another reason is this unwillingness of the state to take ownership of its failures. And just at the moment, there's a trial going on at the Old Bailey of, it's been in the news, a young girl who was murdered, it appears, by her father, her stepmother, and one of his brothers. And they flew to Pakistan. Listeners will know which one I hope talking about. A young girl called Sarah Sharif. Our Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, was interviewed on the BBC, and she was asked not to comment on the case, but wasn't it just another example of the state failing to protect children when they're in school? They knew about them. This girl was known to social services, and the state failed. And the Education Secretary didn't want to say, yes, we failed. She wanted to avoid the question, and she turned it around, and after a couple of sentences said, but the real problem is children we can't see. And we're really worried about them. That's why we're bringing in a register of children not in school. No, Bridget Phillipson, that is not the problem. The problem is the children you're aware of who the state is failing, both educationally and in welfare. They know about, but there is no system that can protect children like the family and the extended family. And where we started, that's been what's been dismantled in Western cultures over my lifetime.
I suppose you could say the flip side of that is it the role of a school to be the social worker? Because if that is the sole reason that states want children in schools, then I think parents who are sending their children to school need to examine if that's why they want to be sending their own kids to school. It's a perversion of the issue, I think.
It is a perversion of the issue. The government, both the last government and the current government, want to make schools a mandatory safeguarding partner. It goes back to when the actual route is when we signed the UNCRC, the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child, that said that education and social care of children should be put together. And it has really blurred the rules. But it is becoming this, that all state provision for children is one big safeguarding partnership, which doesn't work.
Randall Hardy, thank you so much for speaking to me today and for sharing your knowledge from years of looking into these topics, lobbying and campaigning. You've really shared that wealth of expertise with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you so much for joining and listening to or watching the Seatton Education podcast. Wherever you watched us, on YouTube or as a podcast, please subscribe, like, and comment as we discuss how home education can be an achievable alternative to conventional schooling. I hope I'll see you next time.